Good evening and thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Nick Blumberg. The National Guard rolling down Chicago streets. Local leaders say not so fast.
He has absolutely no right and no legal ability to send troops in to the city of Chicago.
Despite President Donald Trump's D.C. police takeover, Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson swat away the president's threat that Chicago could be next.
It's very difficult for us to be able to make cuts of this magnitude and keep the impact off of our school.
CPS bucks calls for major borrowing in its budget proposal and kicks a pension payment down the road unless the district gets an infusion of new cash.
This decision is not reached lightly, nor does it diminish the tragedy that has occurred.
Chicago police officers won't face charges in the fatal shooting of Dexter Reed after a traffic stop. Plus, an Illinois judge won't force local law enforcement to apprehend Texas Democrats taking refuge here. The city sets a speedy timeline for applicants interested in replacing former Alderman Walter Burnett. And former Illinois Republican Party Chair Don Tracy throws his hat in the ring for the U.S. Senate. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Laura Washington from ABC 7 News and the Chicago Tribune, Melody Mercado from Block Club Chicago, Simone Alicea from CityCast Chicago, and from the Chicago Tribune, Jake Sheridan. Thank you all for being here. Let's get right to it. So Laura, President Trump has long made Chicago a target, saying it's a failed city, it's a dangerous place. Is this more of the same, or does it feel like floating the idea of a police takeover is kind of taking things to a new level?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, he hinted at this before when he sent the National Guard into L.A. He was talking a lot about these urban cities. They need to be brought under control. So I think he's also upping the ante. And many of his threats he doesn't follow through on. But I think the city needs to take this one seriously. This is completely in line with his whole law and order strategy, and that's a really big part of his political messaging right now.
Well, and especially because with the LA situation, they were sending in troops when there were, demonstrations,
sure,
some of which had turned violent, whereas in Chicago, crime's down, and there's not like there's any emergent situation they'd be responding to.
Right,
here.
crime's down, but he's misrepresenting the situation here as he's done in D.C. But I think he's probably waiting for an opportunity, another teen takeover or some other, flare up that doesn't last long and probably won't be anything like L.A., but it'll just give him an excuse. And I think that's a real possibility.
Jake, we heard Governor Pritzker say that sending in troops would violate a federal law that goes all the way back to the 1870s, I believe. How do you expect Governor Pritzker or Mayor Johnson to respond? What can they do if Trump makes good on this threat?
They've repeatedly cited that this is against the rules and that they will cite the laws, but they haven't gotten super specific. There's a bit of analysis on Democrats in the Trump era that I think about in this moment. It's kind of silly. It's like the movie Air Bud, where there's a basketball team playing against a golden retriever, and they're saying dogs can't play basketball, and meanwhile they're getting dunked on by a dog. So they're not talking about exactly how they'll stop him, but they are citing the laws. But whether that holds up kind of remains to be seen.
I think that might be the first Air Bud analogy on this show, so gold star to you.
But what they'll do though is they'll file a lawsuit, and
sure,
lawsuits slow everything down. And I think the strategy might just be to get it into court, get past the initial problem, because if it gets into court and they can get a ruling to put whatever Trump's going to do on hold, that gives them some time to maneuver.
And I think all eyes are on the lawsuit happening in California, which just started this week. But again, Donald Trump doesn't really care about legality and laws. I think his history proves that. And so I think that, constituents want to hear some more plans that are going to be in place just in case something like this does happen.
Well, and I mean, obviously the president is saying crime in D.C. is out of control, even though it is down nationwide. And, crime rates per capita are far higher in other municipalities. Do you think he's just going after D.C. because there is that element of federal control, because it's, sort of a blue area, maybe a combination of factors?
I think it's a little bit of both. Technically, Trump is not overstepping legally here in regards to D.C. Because he does have that right to put federal troops in that area. I do think that we're seeing this trend, obviously, with cities that are led by black mayors and blue cities, and I don't think that that's a coincidence.
You know, Simone, we saw the pushback to Trump sending troops to LA. You know, there are, legal actions. What kind of backlash, politically do you think the president might face if he tries to send troops to places beyond DC that aren't under federal jurisdiction? And is that even really a factor for him?
Yeah, I don't know if he cares about the political backlash, but it certainly will happen. I mean, a place like Chicago, that would be my fear, actually, is like, if he decides to circumvent the law or take some kind of opportunity, as Laura was saying, then what happens when you have when you have people in Chicago who are kind of ready to protest, they're ready to stand up, they're like, what kinds of conflicts could that then cause? And then the knock-on effects of what does that mean for our police force and how they're responding? It just seems like there's a real, it's a potential powder keg, if something like that were to happen.
Yeah, the other issue is that the National Guard is not trained for this kind of policing. They're
Yes.
not trained for policing at all. They're a military force, it's a federal military force. Not only that, they don't know these neighborhoods. They don't know these communities, and we know how difficult it's been for the Chicago Police Department, officers who do know these communities, to build trust and to be able to work with the community when there's a problem. So the National Guard is, I think when you see the video of what's going on in DC, you see a lot of National Guards people standing around, because I think it's going to be more for the perception and for the reality in terms of what they can really do.
And what happened in LA, we saw that local police were actually dispatched to help National Guard because they actually made the situation worse and didn't actually help.
Yeah, you could very well foresee an instance where people who are not familiar with the terrain, with the players, that it could actually sort of escalate situations. Well, an Illinois court declined to force local law enforcement to arrest Texas Democrats, which they probably didn't have the legality to do. They're here to try and block that redistricting effort to add 5 GOP seats. Laura, those lawmakers indicating they'll head home soon. What do you think the next front in this fight might be?
Well, I think that they wanted to make a point. They wanted to get a lot of national attention, which they got. They wanted to take another step toward being able to fight back. They can't do that in Texas. When they go back to Texas, there'll be another special session called, and the Texas legislature and governor will get what they want, which is to do the redistricting. But they've got Gavin Newsom now out there in California who's saying he's going to move ahead with redistricting. And I think the governor of New York has been talking about it too. So I think the next front will be, well, tit for tat. If you're going to do this to us, we're not going to sit back and not fight back. We're going to do it to you. Yeah,
fighting fire with fire. Yeah. And of course, establishing precedents that maybe we don't tie redistricting to the census.
A little alarming, I think, if that is the way it goes. I think it was interesting because Pritzker, for his part, played it very like, well, everything's on the table. And, Illinois, of course, already has such strong Democratic majorities that I'm not quite sure how that would play out here. But yeah, also an alarming sort of pattern, potentially. Yeah,
I'm not sure they could find many more Democratic seats. Our map is wonky enough as it is. Indeed. Well, Jake, CPS unveiling its long-awaited budget proposal doesn't include the borrowing that the mayor has long pushed for, doesn't include the pension payment that the mayor has long pushed for the district to make. What kind of reaction did we hear from this proposal?
I think there was a sort of a mixed reaction. We'll really see how the CPS lands its budget now, because it seems like the school board is not totally sold here, that they shouldn't borrow more money to have more additions or to keep some of the investments they have now. It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, Simone, the interim CEO here came over from City Hall. Were you surprised to see that she didn't necessarily put out a budget proposal in line with what the mayor wanted?
I was a little surprised. That was the whole reason we had this fight last fall over the previous CPS CEO, right? That was the whole reason that Mayor Johnson that the board resigned, and then we got a new board, right? And I think it's doubly interesting that now you have a majority of board members, most of which were appointed by Mayor Johnson, who have sent a letter who were like, no, the budget absolutely should include a loan, and we shouldn't be paying this pension payment. And what does that mean now for the vote on what this budget proposal will be? What are the conversations going on among the board? I certainly want to know. I would love to be a fly on that wall because it doesn't seem like there's any consensus at the moment.
Yeah, especially with a budget that they have to sign off on the 28th.
In a couple, 10 days, yeah.
I think it puts a lot of pressure on the city as well, because they're hoping to get some TIF money from the city in the ballpark of, was it about around $300 million. And as the city heads into budget season, that's going to be something that, you know, is going to be a little bit of a pressure point, because the schools are saying, if we get extra money, we'll pay the pension and maybe do some additional things with that.
Yeah, what extra money? I mean, the city is facing a huge deficit of its own that they can't
It's
fill.
interesting. There's a huge interest for the city to have a big TIF surplus, because there's a ratio that the city gets when it declares a TIF surplus. So the schools get about half, the city gets like a quarter. So the bigger the TIF surplus, the better off the city budget is, kind of. It's a one-time thing, but you know, the city does have a reason to kind of do that.
And the aldermen, the people who are going to vote on this, on whether or not this TIF surplus will go to the schools, they benefit, because if they don't get that money from the TIF surplus, that doesn't go to their wards, and there's a lot of infrastructure and economic development needs that they want to fill.
Unless,
so
of course, you're an alder who has a TIF district that is
Yeah.
collecting
Yes.
that money. You know what I mean?
Right. There's a lot of conflicting interests in
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and the state not exactly likely to be forthcoming with any additional money for CPS. Doesn't seem like a priority for them right now. Well, Melody, we heard that the Cook County State's Attorney will not pursue criminal charges against the officers who fatally shot Dexter Reed during a traffic stop last year. What did we hear from State's Attorney Eileen O'Neill Burke about why she came to this decision?
You know, I think primarily part of the decision was that their investigation shows that Dexter Reed fired first, even though following that the officers fired 94 rounds in under, you know, a couple minutes there, ultimately killing him. And I think that was primarily, you know, they were not able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officers put him in a position where they fired first. And so again, there are people that are, you know, obviously outraged over this, specifically the family members who have filed a wrongful death suit against the city, saying that Dexter Reed was a target of a pretextual stop. Officers said that they initially stopped him and wanted to see what was going on because of his seatbelt, but his windows were very tinted, and so people argue that you could not have been able to see him inside the car.
And it will be interesting to see too, you know, CPD has said since this incident that they're going to add, you know, training and regulations related to traffic stops to the consent decree. So you have to wonder whether the lack of charges might ramp up pressure on them to get that moving, because so far that has not been finalized.
Correct. And then of course, with this wrongful death lawsuit that we have going on, the city did not move forward with a settlement agreement, but now the city is going to be in this lawsuit going back and forth for a couple of years, that's estimated to cost you know, about 5 times more than the initial settlement agreement, which was $1.25 million.
And then you're going to see, but the good thing about this lawsuit is that will bring out some of the evidence and answer some of the questions that people have about why he was stopped, what the circumstances were, issues about training, and so that hopefully will provide some kind of a public service.
Yeah, and issues with the folks who stopped him, who there had been at least a couple instances of them, you know, violating the constitutional rights of other drivers that COPA and the superintendent agreed should lead to a suspension there. Well, speaking of suspensions, we learned late today that the officer who fatally shot Crystal Rivera in an incident of friendly fire, he's been stripped of his police powers for an unrelated incident, an alleged battery against an off-duty female officer at a bar in recent days. Laura, were you surprised to see that it took so long for this officer to have those powers stripped, even after that fatal shooting?
Everything is taking so long from the minute he came on the force. There were a number of complaints that didn't come out until after. Unfortunately, the Rivera case. This was obviously a bad actor who should probably, if he was actually, you know, got past probation, should never have gotten on the force. And so this is just one more in a series of mistakes or misjudgments that have led to some really tragic circumstances.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the circumstances of this. Is also very concerning, because the fight was allegedly about wanting that female officer to delete a video that she had on her phone. We don't know what that footage entails, but given his past, I'm would like to know more about that.
So and she had the footage on her phone and was in the bar at the same time he was
Outside the bar.
Outside the
Yeah.
bar. So the presumption is that there was something that inappropriate that he was doing this on that video.
Yes.
And do we know, has that video been obtained by investigators, or what happened to it?
I'm not sure. I think
I
that's
don't think that's
definitely
come through in the reporting yet.
Yeah. Well, Jake, CPD is also facing a lawsuit. They're accused by the ACLU of targeting Black and Latino drivers during traffic stops. ACLU lawyers want the judge to certify this as a class of all Black and Latino drivers in the city. How costly has this issue been for Chicago already?
Well, police misconduct settlements in the last year have just skyrocketed. I mean, we're talking now, I think, over $200 million this year, where it's usually closer to 100, and it's only going up. The Watts cases are coming up. There's dozens and dozens of them. It's just going to cost so much money to handle the police misconduct that's decades old often, but it's a huge problem for the city and its finances.
Yeah, that's interesting. We heard recently from the Corporation Council on our show saying, yeah, we understand that this is expensive, but we are paying essentially for the sins of Chicago's past.
Yeah, and it's almost better to pay now to some extent, or that's their logic at least, than to let it go to court. That could cost 10 times as much. There was a case this year, 2 guys who were imprisoned, vindicated, $120 million settlement total. So,
Although it's interesting, talking about paying for the sins of the past, because the whole reason that we're talking about traffic stops right now is because this used to be about stop and frisk, right? Like this whole, and the sort of when that policy, when it was like, okay, you can't do stop and frisk anymore. Oh, all of a sudden, traffic stops are up. We're having more and more traffic stops, and the pretext of those traffic stops are now coming into question. And so, yes, on some level, this is a longitudinal problem, right, that has spanned many, many years and has spanned generations. But the changes that have been made it's very, at best 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, and a lot of the debate is about, things like a broken tail light, not having your seatbelt on. Obviously, I don't think anyone's in favor of someone having an unregistered handgun that they shouldn't be possessing, but, it puts members of the public at risk. It puts members of CPD at risk to be making these stops.
Yeah, I mean, any encounter between an officer and a driver or someone else, right, is a potential for conflict.
Yeah.
And so the more stops you're making, the more potential conflict. And there's, a lot of evidence to suggest that the stops that are being made are being made primarily in Black and brown neighborhoods, or primarily of Black and brown people in white neighborhoods, right? There are just a lot of questions about it.
Well, over to some political news. Melody, former Alderman Walter Burnett recently resigned. The city gave those interested in applying to replace him just a week to apply. The deadline just passed, I think, at 5 o'clock, so sorry if you were hoping to. You were a little late. But what was the rush there?
I think they're trying to. It's interesting that they're moving for a rush. There really is a front runner here, and that's Alderman Burnett's son, Walter Redmond Burnett, who says he would like to go by Red instead of his father's name. But I think what's more interesting are the qualifications that are listed for these applicants, which only include living in the ward for at least 1 year, and doesn't list priority for any government experience or elected offices held in the past. People argue that when the vacancy for the 35th ward was happening, that the requirements for that were much higher and much more stringent process. And this seems to be a little bit more loosey-goosey in order to let one particular person be able to submit their application and most likely be appointed to the position by the mayor.
A cynic might argue it's tailor-made, but I'm sure there are no cynics on this panel.
Well, you mentioned it's only a week long. You don't need more than a week to consider candidates when you already decide who you're going to pick.
Right.
And I think in this committee, to be fair, is the one that's going to be making the recommendation to the mayor. But this committee was handpicked by the mayor, and obviously is going to follow his dictates.
And to note that everybody, Alderwoman Michelle Harris is on that, but then the 3 community members are longtime allies of now former Alderman Walter Burnett.
I looked at the election board site yesterday, and I saw 2 of them had donated to Burnett's campaign in the last 2 years.
So friends.
Yes, friends.
That's how it goes in Chicago.
That's right. All right, well, Laura, let's look statewide. Former state GOP chair Don Tracy, the first sort of major Republican candidate to announce he's going to run in the primary for Senate. So far, a pretty thin list of GOP candidates for statewide or national office representing Illinois. Do you expect that'll change in the coming months, or is there not much enthusiasm?
It's going to change pretty quickly because the petitions are already out. And I think that the Republican Party in Illinois they're trying to get united. They're trying to regroup. They had a session in Springfield this past week where there was a lot of optimism, but they're in disarray. And Don Tracy is a classic symbol of that because he was the head of the party for several years. And he ended up resigning because there was so much dissension in the party, and he was being personally attacked by some of the more conservative members of the party. So I think that the party is not unified. I think there are not the resources there that you need to run against a Pritzker or run in a very expensive Senate race. So that's why you're seeing so few candidates.
Yeah, especially with 2 of the candidates extremely well funded, the third candidate very well connected and able to raise that money. So it's going to be an uphill climb for them. Well, Simone, the Trump administration going after the union contracts of hundreds of employees at the Environmental Protection Agency here in Chicago. Are you surprised to see these sort of anti-union moves, given that Trump, kind of unusually for a Republican, really was courting unions and union voters in the most recent presidential election?
Sure, but he's sort of not that interested in the EPA, first of all. He's also, he has sort of demonstrated again and again that he is looking to defund particularly any agencies related to health and science, of which the EPA is one, right? This cancellation of contracts is a direct sort of result of other efforts to reduce funding from EPA. There were also cancellation of contracts, I believe, with CDC, FDA, and some other health science organizations as well within the federal government. And so, while the sort of that union represents the working class, right? That may be the voter base. It has sort of nothing to do with his actual agenda that he's looking to enact here.
Yeah. Well, some other union news, Jake. After about 4 years of negotiations, Chicago firefighters appear to have a tentative contract deal with the city. Why have these negotiations dragged on so long?
I think there are a number of things. It seems like the wage part of it has been kind of a settled matter for quite a while. There was some discussion, I understand, in City Hall over staffing requirements. That was during the Lightfoot tenure. I think it stretched a bit into the Johnson tenure as well, over how fire trucks should be staffed. The union was super opposed to minimums coming down on that. I think that was a bit of a holdup, but it looks like it's a done deal now. The members of the union got to pass it, aldermen got to pass it, but it seems like it's heading towards being done.
Well, Melody, CPS facing a lawsuit saying it failed to properly vet a security guard who had multiple arrests and convictions predating his hiring, eventually charged with grooming and assaulting a 15-year-old girl. Do you think parents might have any more fears about sort of problem staffers slipping through the cracks, given that CPS is looking to reduce its front office staff that would be checking on those sorts of things?
I mean, absolutely. If I was a parent and I was sending my child to a CPS school, that would be top of mind reading this story, especially the fact that this individual was arrested 16 times before he was ultimately hired by CPS, and also admitted to being a part of a gang in Chicago. Yeah. And that was documented with CPD. I think that, parents obviously send their kids to school to be safe, and a security guard is supposed to help keep your child safe, and to find out they were doing the exact opposite and they weren't even qualified to hold the job in the first place is terrifying.
Well, we've got about 30 seconds left, but some positive news before we go, Laura. We've got a new announcement of a leader at the Chicago Sun-Times and WBEZ, somebody with deep Chicago roots. Tell us about her.
Kimberly Kelly. I've known Kimberly for many years. She worked at the Chicago Reporter early in her career. She earned her chops as a journalist here in Chicago. Then she went on to the Washington Post, the LA Times, won a Pulitzer. A very distinguished, nationally known journalist who wants to come back home to take over this sort of big, exciting high-profile news organization that's merged with BZ, merging with the Chicago Sun-Times at a very crucial time at this point in the merger when they're trying to really bring the newsrooms together. And so it's going to be a big challenge for her, but she's a big personality and a big journalist, so hopefully she's up for it.
I bet she's up to it, and none of you were a big challenge. You were great, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this evening. So our thanks to Laura Washington, Melody Mercado, Simone Elisea, and Jake Sheridan. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Tonight's presentation of Week in Review is made possible in part by Ann and Rich Carr, BNSF Railway, and Francine and Dr. Anthony Brown. Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by
And that's our show for this Friday night. Visit our website to get caught up on the biggest news of the week. And while you're there, check out our Summer Festival Guide. Plenty of summer left still. Now for the Week in Review, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay informed. Have a great weekend. Okay, Jake, you had a piece this week about a topic most of us might not think much about, storefront signage. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so aldermen, especially on the south and west side, feel like these signs that cover every inch of a ton of storefronts, especially gas stations, nail salons, they want to get those signs out of there. They want to clean up their shopping corridors. They think it looks bad. It's crazy how much of the storefront is covered in some of these places. I went to a Philly cheesesteak shop, and there was like a small little sliver of light, like in a church, you know, and it was wild. So they want to get rid of that. Some people feel like it's anti-business, so yeah.
I think the debate about aesthetics is so interesting.
Yeah.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm working to preserve the dignity and rights of all individuals.